On this episode here, we have the author of Get the Picture and past books Cork Dork, Bianca Bosker. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you on. Your name is Alliterative, which has a lot of power to it, kind of like Palm Pilot, BlackBerry, Coca-Cola, all these things. They, they stay in mind more clearly than if it was not the case, which is a cool thing. Wonderful.
Thanks.
I'm glad to have you on. I thought of something, interestingly enough. I have these little, I'm going to add more of my personality these days because I always leave it out in past discussions. But you had Cork Dork. Your current book, Get the Picture, could also be thought of as Art Smart. And then if there's a future book on cheese, you could call it Cheese Louise.
Yeah.
So we got
My husband and I had a really fun time coming up with a whole series of potential books after Corp Dork. I could write a book about cutlery fanatics, and it could be called Fork Dork, or a book about the swine industry, and it could be Pork Dork. Um, so, you know, physics, it could be like Cork Dork. Anyways, there's, lots of spin-offs here.
This is true. I thought of one other one if it was talking about just specifically painting and art, painting, fainting, like people that are just so taken by paintings that they're
Maybe one
falling to the
day, you
ground.
never know.
I got all these ideas. I don't include enough of my ideas, so these days I'm trying to include more of my ideas. Now, another thing I thought of too was when I thought of you with your content on Cork Dork, it makes me think of Gary Vaynerchuk. I watched a lot of his wine videos, even though I didn't drink wine, and and then your current book in the category of art, and also your appearance reminds me of a person I've had on the guest show before, costume designer Mary Mullen from Scottish Ballet. There's like a cultural and artistic appreciation, same thing there.
Cool.
Sometimes I think of people in that way. For the book, Get the Picture, what caused you to go in this direction? Why did you want to examine art from the actual landscape of where people are putting it out there in galleries and in the internet form, Instagram, other places where people are putting art?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this book project and this whole journey into art really started from a point of frustration. I felt like, art had been a passion of mine growing up, but by the time I reached adulthood, we were no longer on speaking terms. I think perhaps like some of the viewers, like I would go to these exquisitely appointed galleries and museums with their, white walls and hushed rooms, and turn a corner and, see a group of people quietly contemplating, I don't know, like limp vegetables on a stained mattress. And I felt like everyone got the punchline except me. And it sort of got to this point where I felt like I didn't understand art. I didn't feel like I belonged, and I kind of backed away. And that may not have changed, except a few years back, I was at my childhood home in Oregon helping my mom clean her basement, and I came across a painting by my grandmother, inspired by her time as a Holocaust survivor in a displaced persons camp. And, art had not been, as far as I know, a big part of her life up until that point. But when she was in this DP camp, she actually started teaching art classes to the kids there. And she made this painting of dancing carrots inspired by this dance performance they did, where she helped them scrimp together materials to make costumes in the shape of carrots. And she chose carrots because she was trying to find something that wasn't like a loaded symbol, like red of an apple might suggest communism, birds, fighter planes, but carrots seemed innocuous enough. And from that point forward, art became an essential part of her life. It was this thing that she turned to in the moment that life turned itself inside out. And I came across these carrots and they just wouldn't leave me alone. I flew back to New York, but they just kept dancing my mind round and round this question of why my grandmother had treated art, the seemingly the least essential thing, as essential. And I think, they also found me at this time in life where I was living this like really hyper optimized existence that didn't make time for what I considered frivolous things like art or bathroom breaks. I was the sort of, I don't know, kind of overstimulated New Yorker who like texted from the toilet while listening to podcasts on like 2 times speed. And yet, I felt like, okay, maybe I was missing something by turning my back on art. And so I decided I would try again. And when I started poking around the art world again, I just couldn't look away. The art still befuddled me, but the people fascinated me. I'd never met a group of people willing to sacrifice so much for something of so little obvious practical value. I met these gallerists who maxed out credit cards to show these mangled humps of metal they swore could change the world. Artists, who picked fights with the color blue. And I was surprised to discover that scientists are right there with artists and telling us that art is a fundamental part of our humanity, as necessary, as one biologist puts it, to us as food or sex. And at the same time, I was intrigued by the way these art fiends, their reality did not operate according to any rules of nature that I understood. They had this expansive approach to life that made my own life feel claustrophobic by comparison. And to be fair, they pitied me. They told me I lacked visual literacy, which they said was downright dangerous in a world so saturated with images. And so I just became fixated on this question of whether I could see art, whether I could see the world the way they did, and what might change if I could. And so I decided to throw myself into the nerve center of the fine art world and see what I could find out. And when I say throw myself in, I do mean it rather literally. I'm a journalist and I do interviews, I read research reports, but I also believe in learning by doing. And I had this admittedly ambitious goal of going to actually work in the art industry and then reporting back on what I learned. And unfortunately, basically no one except me thought that was a particularly good idea.
That's funny. There's a good comment there about the non-practical nature of it. There's something I think of where, especially now, because the practical items of the world, in my view, this has been my theme for many years, will all be done more quickly by machines, artificial intelligence, robotics, and whatnot. And the last elements that will be handled are creativity, artistic domain, the things that we actually go for. I think of it like the weekend and the weekdays. People usually have things that they go to on the weekends that are not the quote practical things, but that's the thing they're looking forward to the most. But then they downplay it in life and say, oh, what is that? What are you guys doing? But if they didn't have that show to go to, the weekend wouldn't be great. There's a funny dichotomy there of the non-practical element. So that's funny when you describe that of the artists, that they really went into the non-practical world. But in the bigger picture, they might have a more practical sense of what life is.
Yeah, well, I think that I at least was, I think, victim of this idea. I mean, I'd always thought of art as a luxury. I mean, it can't like clothe you, feed you, or be used to kill predators, right? And I will say that by the kind of, as I got further and further into this journey, I ended up selling art at galleries, working with artists in their studios, patrolling museum wings as a security guard. I began to understand why it is that scientists and artists agree that art is a fundamental part of our humanity. I mean, there's many explanations for why it may have evolved to be something essential, not just this thing that we turned to when we, sort of started living past age 40 and invented fire. You know what I mean? But in fact, that there are a lot of arguments that really art is essential. It is an evolved behavior. And if you think about it, I mean, art is one of our oldest activities. We invented paint long before the wheel. It's one of our oldest forms of communication. We were painting long, long, long before we could write. And one of our most universal kind of, pursuits, right? Like we all engage with art, whether we're Parisians or Paleolithic humans or preschoolers. And I also think that we engage with art in many more places than we realize. Our kind of broad kind of idea of what art is these days has sadly, I think, been narrowed by these rather arbitrary distinctions that status-conscious Europeans made in the 1760s. They sort of, again, made the rather arbitrary choice to separate some things into the realm of fine arts, right? Painting, poetry, sculpture, etc. And then everything else kind of got lumped together as craft. And there was this idea that art, fine art, could elevate your soul, it could change you, and craft was sort of everything else. It was, useful but not soul-shaking material of artisans rather than geniuses, right? These creative genius artists. And I think that is kind of an artificial distinction. I think the artists that I worked with, the people I got to know, the experiences I had really have helped me to see art, to have that experience of art in so many more places than I did before. And that's exciting. I mean, that jostle that our brains get from art doesn't just have to happen at a painting or a sculpture. It can happen at a bridge. It can happen, in watching an airplane take off. And it's a blast to be open to the nuance, beauty, and chaos of that experience.
Do the artistic people you have run across see more art in their day-to-day life than the average person? Can they see something and examine it and, oh, wow, more than the person who's not in that world and not already looking in that way?
I think so. I think, there are some studies that have been done that suggest this. But also just anecdotally, I've seen it happen, right? Like I ended up working for an artist named Julie Curtis, and it was really astounding to me the way that she turned an artistic eye on the everyday. And what I mean is, like, I think she had this ability to look at the everyday world like it was a sort of an art object, with this willingness to kind of take an extra beat, to linger, to look closer, to question, to sort of ponder the miraculous sort of impossibility of so many things around us, to question why and how. Going back to sort of explanations for why art may be a necessary part of the human experience, what I found interesting is that scientists and artists have actually reached a sort of similar explanation for why that may be the case. When we look at the world, we do not see it like video cameras, right? We do not go around accurately and dispassionately recording the scenes around us, right? It's not like everything is in focus. Really, vision is a hallucination. We are not nearly as good of seers as we think. Our brains actually are more like trash compactors, right? We have these filters of expectation that descend when we look out in the world to preemptively sort, dismiss, prioritize, categorize all the raw data coming in, even before we get the full picture. And, I think a lot of us don't notice that in our everyday lives. That's just kind of how we've evolved. But it's I remember being at a vision conference with a bunch of scientists, and the point was illustrated to me very well when one of these ophthalmologists challenged me to name the color of the lanyard around a presenter's neck. And I was like, oh my God, I was staring at him for an hour and a half, and I'm not even sure if he was wearing a lanyard, right? It's like, and that I think is, one just small example of that filter of expectation and action. The data's coming in, but we don't register, we don't pay attention to it. Now, art, on the other hand, again, scientists and artists, I think, have come to this explanation. Art can help us fight those reducing tendencies of our minds. Art is not always pleasant to look at, but it can introduce a glitch that is a gift, a glitch that helps our minds jump the curve. We have this tendency to, I think art can help us keep our minds from sort of overfitting to the data. They can sort of throw our minds out of these well-worn pathways. And that's not only exciting, but essential. I mean, I think going to see art keeps our brains nimble. It keeps us open to seeing things, noticing in new places. And also, I think, just being able to look at the world with this flexible mindset and see beyond, sort of see what's really there rather than our brains kind of assume is there, which I think is hugely exciting. It's something, I've experienced myself. I mean, I spent basically at least 5 years, depending on you count, working on this book project and journeying into the world of art and trying to develop my eye. And my experience of art has changed in the process, but my experience of the world has changed as well.
One thing you're making me think of is, I always relate things, I guess, lately back to artificial intelligence, but the large language models are taking all the text that people have put out, or even now pictures and videos, and flattening it in a way. So it's the opposite of what art does, because art gives depth of layers, whereas these are meant to take 100 pages and simplify it down to one page, thus taking away any nuance, variety, depth, what gives it its personality. And so it's like a counterforce of sorts. But if we do that with everything we do in our life, then it'll all be flat. We basically reduce the dimensions of the life we take part in, and then we can't handle ambiguity as well. We can't make a network of connections as well. Did you notice that artistic individuals were able to link ideas quite well, or try something and then reach out to another field and then link that in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, just as one example of this sort of like filter of expectation in action that I found really interesting. And it's a simple, simple, simple example, but I think it's a powerful one. And that is the idea of color constancy. Now, color constancy is a term that refers to our brain's ability, I should say, our brain's kind of architecture and its way of overriding the changing colors in our environment, even when the stimuli in the environment is changing. So let's take a bowl of lemons as an example. If you have a bowl of lemons sitting out on your kitchen counter and you see those lemons under, you know, basically any lighting condition, you're going to say, hey, those are yellow lemons, right? Like we know that lemons are yellow and they don't spontaneously change color. Now, there are certain color conditions under which those lemons, I should say, there's certain lighting conditions under which those lemons could actually look green, in the sense that, the light bouncing off their skin may have a wavelength closer to what we might call green. Now, when we look at those under those different lighting conditions, we don't say, whoa, those are green lemons. Our brains override. That color constancy kicks in and we say, they're yellow. They are yellow lemons. And so what's remarkable is that there's research that suggests that there's a group of people who is particularly good at suspending color constancy, and that's artists. And, there's, so many examples, but there's uh, the amazing Monet's paintings of the Rouen Cathedral. And so he did these paintings of it, over, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. He did these paintings in I'm going to say like 30 different lighting conditions of the same cathedral in France. And, we might look out at the kind of, the regular non-artistic person might look out and just sort of, how that color constantly could kick in and be like, it's limestone, it's the same beige, day in, day out, morning, afternoon, night. And if you look at these paintings, the facade of the cathedral changes so much. It's purple some days. It's like these poppy orange others. And, there's an argument that was not just artistic license. That is us being able to watch him suspending color constancy, lifting that filter of expectation in action. And so that was something that I thought so much about when I was working with the artist Julie Curtis. I watched her one day painting a gray bathroom stall, and what I would consider gray, is a rather dull color, right? It's just gray, I mean, whose favorite color is gray? It's like gray, meh, and yet, like, for her, she's trying to kind of copy this wall in her studio, take inspiration from it, and to mix gray, I mean, she used lavender, orange, pink, white, black, green, I mean, just countless colors came together. And I felt like I was watching her sort of lift that filter of expectation in action. And I began to think about that when I walked around the city in my day-to-day life. I began to really challenge myself to question color, to look more deeply, to see if I could lift my filter of expectation, to see if I could move beyond color constancy. And it is a blast. It is a delight. I mean, there's a building on East 81st Street that has literally like made me tear up at its this glowing orange. I'm like a little dog. Like, I'll go to Central Park in the spring and I'm like running around in search of these colors. I mean, they feel practically hedonistic. They're like, tickling my eyes. And I think it's amazing. And anyone can do it for yourself. I mean, look at a white wall in your room and begin to challenge yourself. Like, is it really white? Probably not, right? It's maybe more purple or yellow or green, or maybe all of the above, depending on how the shadows fall. So I think that, again, it's a simple example of lifting that filter of expectation and opening ourselves up to more information. But I think if it happens on such a basic level, I mean, imagine what else we can see and experience.
That's an interesting one. It's the case I've noticed in each category that, let's say with artists, they may have an ability to do color constancy more than the average person. Some of the food experts have a super tasting tongue that puts them in a certain category of ability. You might have in the computer programming field, maybe a person with Asperger's might have more ability to focus on text or something for a longer time, things like that. It's kind of cool that each category or personality types links with maybe dentistry or accounting or whatever it might be. I've always found that to be a cool feature. That person can bring that to others and pass that on because that's their area of expertise for their lifetime in a way. Who are some of, when you're in the art world, who are some of the key players that come to mind that keeps the art world functioning smoothly?
I mean, there's so many. I think that, you know, for me, I will say that, I think that, like, as I said, I really wanted to throw myself into the middle of the action. I wanted to see what went on in the sort of nerve center of the fine art world. To me, I kind of picked that because these are the people who have an outsized influence over our history, over our idea of what art is. I also wanted to get into the room where the action happens because to me, like, I wanted to see how does an art go from being this germ of an idea in an artist's studio to this cultural icon that we, fawn over in museums. Because I think all the decisions that affect an artwork are also decisions that affect us. Again, our idea of what art is, but also like who makes it, why we should bother to engage with it. And so I think that I was initially very drawn to up and coming artists, emerging artists, and the people that work with them, because to me, that's the highest stakes and least covered part of the art world. I think that's where, these are artists who, they're working, I mean, a handful of jobs just to be able to do the work they really want to do, which is to paint or make videos or make sculptures. They do mental math to figure out if they can afford a bagel. I mean, for gallerists and also artists, a single sale could be the difference between like keeping the lights on, right? Being able to keep a studio, being able to keep a gallery. I will say that, I very deliberately thought it would be interesting to start my time working in the art world at a gallery, because a gallery kind of touches all parts of what artists call the machine, right? A gallerist, they, spend time with artists doing studio visits. They spend time with collectors who buy the work. They spend time schmoozing with museum curators who sort of hold the keys to the canon of art history. And at the same time, I think as I got further on this journey and as I kind of stepped back to think about it as a book, it also became very important to me to bring many of these parts of the world together. I think that for me, a lot of the books I read about the art world sort of dealt with one part of it in particular. It might be an artist's biography. It might be an art historical text that looked backwards in time. It might be about the market. But to me, I think to really understand this world, how it works, what it values, what it celebrates, why, and for us to develop our eyes just as people who engage with art, but as people who are participants in the machine, it was important to discuss all of these parts. So I, eventually I worked at, a couple different galleries. I spent time, wheeling and dealing art at an art fair during Art Basel Miami Beach. I worked in artist studios. I focused on one artist in particular, Julie Curtis, but also a performance artist named Amanda Alfieri. Her online name is Mandy Alfieri. I worked as a security guard at the Guggenheim because I wanted to see inside the sort of uppermost echelon of this world and how it really worked. I spent time with curators, with collectors. I mean, I think I was lucky to also be in New York, which kind of has all parts of the food chain. And so I tried to just see as much as I could. And I will say there's so much research that I did that didn't explicitly make it into the book. I mean, amazing other artists that I worked with in their studios, other art fairs I went to. I mean, just so much else that really felt necessary for me to be able to understand my thinking around these subjects and write about them with confidence and authority. But again, that may not be explicitly mentioned on the page.
It's a good point there, just about the book writing process. So much goes into it, then it's collated and distilled down into.
It's like an iceberg, you know what I mean? It's like there's
so much above, and then there's all the little difficulties, and that didn't work out, but that person should have added that information. We can't include that. Got to cut that part out. Oh, that'll be too long. This thing, that, and then you get that version. But footnotes are pretty cool. Little edges there. One thing that comes to mind when you're describing the people you come across, I once had Crystal Lynn on the show. She's a painter, and we talked about her artistry. And I remember when I was analyzing her work, I saw it at the Los Angeles Fashion Week because she would have a display there at the Art Hearts event. she had a certain style with these things I call kind of like squiggly lines and colors and whatnot. And then after her, I started to notice, oh, each person is like putting out their mind as their art. It looks like that. Hers had a certain style. Nobody's looked like hers. The other artist, this one, Brandon Bugazi, he makes like like metal and glitter and all these things art. Nobody looks like that. Like they're just, I've never seen a copy of each one. You would know immediately. And then if they didn't do it, what a shame that would be, because a part of their mind is not put out there. What are your thoughts on each person who has some semblance of creativity, the opportunity lost, or if they don't do it, and how cool it is when they do it?
Yeah, well, I think that, you know, as I said before, like artists warned me that I lacked visual literacy, and this inspired me to work to develop my eye. And when I say eye, I mean it not like the organ, but rather in this sort of art connoisseur sense of, this painstakingly cultivated outlook that enables you allegedly to see a lot that doesn't meet the eye, like, who's going to be the next Warhol, or like what's transcendent about a painting of a black square on a black square, right? And I will say that I encountered some frustrations along the way of developing my eye, which we can talk about, but I felt like I had this breakthrough when I was eventually working with artists in their studios. And I felt like something clicked while I was, stretching canvases and washing brushes. And I began to understand how to savor art like an artist. And that meant slowing down, paying attention to the physical form of the piece, and examining the decisions that the artist had made. I think that when it comes to art, we've been told for the last 100 years or so that what really matters about a work is the idea behind it. The thought trumps the thing. And all of the kind of like hushed murmuring that goes on in galleries and museums about like postmodernism and indexicality hadn't prepared me for the blistery business of actually making art. I mean, making art is practically athletic. It is a physical process. You're wrestling with materials, like almost like, lost a finger to a stapling gun. You're trying to make things stick, stay, lay. You are fighting gravity. You are grappling with physics, whether it's a painting or a sculpture or something else. I mean, it's difficult. You're problem solving. And again, it's physical. And as the artist Julie Curtis told me, an idea is not a painting. Painting is constant decision making. And that helped me. I mean, when I started going back and looking at art, I, for the first time in my life, ignored the wall labels. And instead, I forced myself to stay in the art. Not only did I examine the decisions, but I also used a prompt that was suggested to me by an artist, which was just to notice 5 things in the work. And they didn't have to be, heady or, philosophical, like, this is a commentary on like, you know, power and social relations in the aftermath of the French Revolution. It could just be, like this line gives me chills, you know what I mean? Or like this blue makes me want to lick it. I mean, it's noticing these physical things. It's noticing the decisions. And I bring this up, going back to your point about, sort of artist individual expression. I had all of these ideas in mind when I started working as a security guard at the Guggenheim. And on my posts, initially I was very, very bored, I will admit. I used to like mentally just beg someone to like try and touch something so I could run over and tell them not to. But I began to give myself these challenges to, for example, spend 40 minutes, the full time I had on one post, examining a single work of art. And I would challenge myself to notice 5 things and then 5 more things and to keep finding something new. And I felt like I began to develop relationships with the artworks that I guarded on the ramps. And some of these relationships were a little hostile. There were pieces that I felt like, they were grating. They were kind of annoying. Like I just like they didn't offer up much. They just weren't very good company. But then there were pieces where I felt like real friendships. Like I would, go out of my way and like cut into my breaks just to like get near them and sort of say hello. And I think that, there was this sense for me where I think I began to relate to these physical objects almost as if they were people. And I think in that sense, there is this kind of humanity that courses from an artist through into their work. And I'm not saying it's a perfect metaphor, but bear with me because I think that there's similarities. I think, in the same way that like FaceTiming with someone is not the same as sitting down to dinner with them. Seeing a painting on Instagram is not the same as seeing it face to face, as standing next to it, as sort of being there with two bodies in space. I think that we've, I mean, I at least felt this way. I felt like I had really lost sight of the way that looking at art can be a deeply physical experience, that you are these sort of two bodies together. The modernists helped inculcate this idea that art should be really a philosophical experience, like a little bloodless, it's about ideas. And yet, when you watch artists in their studios, again, like they are making bodies. I mean, they are creating things, they are making decisions. They're not just sitting there with a snifter of brandy, like contemplating sunbeams and brainstorming ideas. And so, again, I mention all of this because I do think that I at least found it kind of helpful and revealing to think about engaging with work almost like it was another living being. By the same token, it's like you may have a friend that I'm not friends with. There may be an artwork that I am obsessed with and in love with that doesn't do anything for you, right? And that's okay. And so I think just one more thing about looking at art. Being a guard helped me really rethink the way that I went to go see art as a civilian or saw art in my free time. And, I used to go to museums and I felt like in order to get my money's worth, I had to see every single thing on the wall. Like that was the way that I like did it, like check, 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 every single piece, sprint through, totally exhausting, totally overwhelming. And I began to realize as I worked as a guard, that's sort of the equivalent of like going to an all you can eat buffet and then wondering why you feel a little sick after you've stuffed yourself on like, spaghetti and meatballs and sushi and waffles and mimosas. And I think going to a museum can really be instead more of this a la carte experience. Like you don't have to look at everything. You don't have to like everything. Having seen now the process by which things end up on the walls of these hallowed institutions, I can tell you it's not a perfect process. These are not like the unequivocal, definition of the best that the art world has to offer. Like the things that we see there, they are the product of decisions made by individuals who are flawed and working with certain constraints, just like any of us. And some of them will speak to you more than others. Some of them will kind of be there for a friendship or a deep relationship more than others. And so I think, if I can give anyone, my unsolicited advice, it's to slow down and, not feel like you have to see everything. And when I say slow down, I mean slow down. Like there's research that shows that we spend something like 2 seconds to at the top end 17 seconds looking at an artwork. And take it from me, maybe it's not every piece that does it for you, but having now spent hours and weeks looking at the same works of art over and over and over, I can tell you that they're ones where you will keep discovering something new, you will keep feeling something new, and it will be like a relationship with a person where you and the work keep evolving together.
A lot of life themes come through in this description that comes to mind, a few concepts as well, that it's like depth in one item versus across many. Recently I saw a thing that said if you practice 10,000 different like basketball shots one time versus practicing one basketball shot 10,000 times, that one will have way more impact than you try a little bit of everything. And this concept you're bringing up of the need to, there's an illusion, it's like online, same thing with the way people use internet services. Oh, there's 400 things. Well, I better look at all 400 things. Oh, I'm tired now. That didn't work out well. Versus you focus on one item. Same thing with the paintings you had described now, and I saw one other description where you talked about how you, maybe 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, and you keep seeing new things. It's like when you read a book, second time around, you would think, I already read the book. Yes. But the first time around, there was 94 things that you skipped maybe, or didn't see it that way, or your timing of your life didn't match the thing that was being described. And then now, oh, wait a minute, or you hear a song from 20 years ago. Now, oh, they were saying that. I thought it was saying this joyful thing, but actually it was talking about this part of existence. There's a lot to the depth of it and slowing down. How does the average person get into slowing down if they are more in the frantic category?
I mean, look, it's hard, right? I mean, the only time that I had spent 40 minutes looking at an artwork before becoming a guard was never. I mean, it took me like, the threat of getting fired and like 17 different security cameras to get me to really slow down, to not pull out my phone, to stay focused. And I think that it's not easy, right? It's like we do. I think we're all sort of aware of the ways that our attentions have become a little gnat-like. I mean, there's just so much competing for our attention. It's practically survival. And yet, um, if people are curious for a different experience, or maybe, you know, yeah, I don't even think it has to be, that you're trying to like change your life in a big way. Just curious to engage with the world in a slightly different way, in a way that is kind of as far as you can get from like scrolling through a feed. Just give it a try. Just sit yourself down on a bench in front of an artwork and, you know, spiritually handcuff yourself there. You know what I mean? Like, I think that, and you could work up to it, right? I mean, there was an art historian who wouldn't let her students write about an artwork for her class until they'd spent, I can't remember the exact number, but something, it was either like 2 hours or 3 hours staring at an artwork. And you don't have to start with 2 hours. You could, I mean, more power to you, but like maybe you start with 10 minutes, right? Maybe, and then you kind of work up from there. But you know, try it. And maybe, you try like 10 minutes with, you go to like your local gallery or your local museum, and you pick one piece and you do 10 minutes, another piece in 10 minutes, another piece in 10 minutes. And the next time you go back, it's 30 minutes with one piece. I think you can try different forms, but I think that it's exciting to be flexible in the way that we see the world. The art world really opened me up to understanding the way that looking is an adventure. And I hope people will decide to go on that adventure with me, or just on them by themselves when they go look at art.
It's a very interesting thing to me that this concept here, you can do a lot during a day, but let's say you look at a painting for 15 minutes or you meditate for 10 minutes, even though you did all the things during the day. I think for most people, the most memorable part of that day was I spent 10 minutes not doing anything, meditating, or 15 minutes examining this painting at that moment, or those 18 minutes I had to wait for something and I didn't want to do that. Somehow that's the most, you remember that a week later versus the 94 things that occurred that were happening and rolling. They were gone for the most part as far as memory. It's a very inverted thing from what you would think. You would think this was no time and this was go time. But go time is sort of no time, and then no time is go time mentally.
Yeah. Interesting.
One thing that comes to mind, you brought up earlier, the vision. I saw on some other program, you might have mentioned this too, that we see something like 0.035% of the light spectrum, and you describe what our brains do. It doesn't, we just basically reduce everything down to what works for us. This is a mouse, that's a book, the color of the lemon is yellow, and that's what we work with. Is the way to get out of that landscape to understand what we are not seeing and think about that regularly to remind us, or do we just push that to the side, and if it's a book, it's a book, and keep it at that?
Well, I think that, it is fascinating to think about how much of the light spectrum we can't see, and other animals can see. I think bumblebees, right, have like a totally different view of colors in the world than we do. I mean, you should really interview a bumblebee. You know what I mean? Be like, what do you see? But I
think that I have interviewed a butterfly expert.
There, yeah. See, it's close, right?
Close.
And I think that I don't think that we necessarily have to like contemplate like the unseen spectrum so much as I think that there's something very rewarding about slowing down and consciously fighting our brain's impulse to compress the world around us. There's different ways of doing that. I mean, again, I think that art is practice for doing that, right? I think that, as I said before, there's an argument that art functions much in the same way as dreams. They introduce, like I said, these glitches, these fictions, these things that we maybe hadn't seen before, these things that we think couldn't exist, right? Like we fly in our dreams, right? Or I don't know, we see a painting or a sculpture of a cigarette with, instead of smoke coming out of it, like a long trail of gray hair. This is a sculpture I saw in Julie Curtis's studio. There are these things that are kind of impossible in our daily life, but art, like dreams, reminds us not to rule it out. It sort of reminds us that, like, what we see or what we think we see in the world around us is maybe not the full extent of what reality could be. I think that that's sort of what art really does. It introduces like this kind of jostle into our brains. And so I think when I talk about lifting that filter of expectation, I think part of it means, as I said before, it means like forcing yourself to pause and contemplate what is there versus what you assume is there. I'm sitting here and like looking beyond you at like a plant that I have on my desk. I have this plant. It's a flamingo lily, and it's been here for a pretty long time. But like as I'm sitting here, I'm realizing like I've never really stopped to like contemplate the shape of the leaves. I mean, the leaves are like very surreal. They're like these hearts. They have these lines going through them, and I think that you know there's something to be gained by studying the everyday with the same care that we might study an artwork, right? So again, it's like notice 5 things in your succulent on your desk, right? Or, just there was an artist I also, during the pandemic, we started doing these drawing exercises together where we would meet on FaceTime. And Liz Ainsley is the artist, and we would work, and she would, we would come up with these great exercises, and we would challenge ourselves to do different things, like draw your foot, or like draw your teeth without looking at them, or like draw someone without looking at a photo of them. Or, one of the most interesting exercises that I really loved was where we each had to take an object and describe it to the other person as though we were an alien describing this thing. So, imagine that you had, I don't know, like, imagine where I was like, okay, it's got these like two black symmetrical wings at the bottom, and then going up at the top, there's like these 6 really slender kind of tong-like shapes, and 3 go in one direction and 3 go in the other direction. And so we had to draw this, right? I am in fact describing a hair clip.
It's
So,
like, huh?
but there's something she described it. It's like you know it's basically it's seeing something by unseeing it, sort of like breaking it down in its parts. And Liz Ainsley described, sort of this. I would think of it as like a sort of an artistic mindset she took to riding the subway, where it was like she began to just sort of look at how impossible it was that this thing existed, this disembodied voice, calling over the loudspeakers, these, huge tunnels, these like, tesserae of colored seats. And, I think that lifting that filter of expectation is sort of, in some ways, not letting yourself automatically like make sense, categorize, but instead breaking it down, going back to basics, and just noticing. And I think on that note, I do believe that there is an artist in each of us, to the extent that we do fight to keep our brains from reducing and oversimplifying our experience of the world. Art is a choice. It's a fight against complacency, and it's a decision to live a life that's richer and more complex and ultimately more beautiful.
There was a while where one of my terms that I would use regularly to my friends would be glitch. So I talk about something being a glitch or a variation to it, and that really speaks to me because those things are an agitation to the regular that exists, because there's a template, and the only way to make a new form of a template or a new thing that people will use is somehow it has to be glitched or altered in some way, and you'll get to that form. And then suddenly that's the new thing, and people are like, oh, is that the thing? Okay. And then if you're using a fixed thinking, that's the thing now. That's the thing we use, and that's the standard operating procedure for the next 6 years. But then you need the glitch work, like the research and development category of art, or that kind of thinking to get to the next one, or else we're stuck with this standard operating procedure or the same car shape for the next 900 years. And then that would be, I think that would take away from people's internal joy in some form if that was removed. That's a fun one.
Yeah,
Or even
that's
when you're
interesting to
walking,
think. The celebration of the glitch.
a celebration of the glitch. That could be a title. It also, when you're walking in an area that you drove past many times, it's like you never drove past it ever. Oh, there's this flower. Oh, this person had this sign there. I've driven past this 942 times. This all existed right there. The concept of that this all existed right there has always been entertaining to me. Even when you travel, you go to a location and you're like, this was here the whole time. I was there. They were doing that. I was there. And after you did it, you know. Before you did it, you don't. Does art does art keep the mind active and healthy?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think also, one thing we haven't talked about that I think is oftentimes underestimated is beauty. And beauty, I think we have a complicated relationship with beauty in this day and age. I think the art world certainly does. When I started, spending time with people in the art world, I quickly understood that for the last 100 years or so, the art world has been kind of on a war against beauty. There was this decision in the aftermath of World War I among European artists. You had people who had suffered and seen just terrible things, that the world didn't deserve beauty, right? And that beauty was too frivolous of a thing to pursue in a time when there was so much else that was necessary for humans to tackle and solve. And this idea has persisted. I think it isn't just unique to the art world. I think there's sort of this idea among sort of like polite circles and like the sort of intelligentsia that beauty is suspect. It is corrupted and corrupting, falling for its charms, sort of a sign of moral weakness. And I think it's a pity, and I think it's a misunderstanding. I think we might think that we're done with beauty, but beauty definitely is not done with us. There is certainly almost a biological predisposition to certain forms of beauty. But more than that, I think that beauty is rewarding. It's essential, and I think beauty does not have to be the visual equivalent of a vanilla cupcake. There's been, debates for millennia over how to define beauty. And, there's been arguments that it's a physical form, right? That certain proportions make things beautiful. There's the idea that it's a sort of moral quality that makes things beautiful. I came to feel like, beauty doesn't even have to be something physical. I think beauty is this moment where your mind jumps the curve. Like beauty is this moment where you're drawn deeper into life. Beauty is something that nudges you to the place where you're wondering about the world and your place in it. You want to get closer to this thing. You just want to, study it, understand it, bask in its presence. And I think that what art can also help us do is to expand our sense of beauty. I think there's something very exciting about that. I mean, I at least experienced it in my own experience with art. I mean, I think that I felt like along the way in the course of this journey, I mean, I gradually turned my entire life over to art, as listeners may get the sense. I was like, I worked as a guard, right? I was like a deadbeat to most of the beloved people in my life. I ended up letting a nearly naked stranger sit on my face in the name of art. Like I was all in. And I felt like I really was having this identity crisis when it came to my own taste. And I realized that part of it was I was beginning to see beauty in all of these places I never would have appreciated it before. As in a sewage treatment plant, for example, the artist Julie Curtis came in one day and was raving about how beautiful these shit tits, which is, these digester eggs is really the proper name for them. But there's these huge, kind of teats full of sewage that you can see on the New York skyline. And she was like, they're absolutely beautiful. And sewage and beauty were not things that had gone hand in hand for me together. But I began to seek those digester eggs, those shit tits out on the skyline. I began to wonder about them. I wanted to get close to them. And I realized they were beautiful, right? That was beauty. Beauty was in this sort of magnetic draw towards something. It was this pull into life. It was something that kind of made you give an ecstatic, like, hell yes to what life had to offer. And I think that can happen with a thing. It can happen with a sunset. It can happen with an artwork. It can even happen with an idea. And I think it's important to be open to it, to understand its value, and also to challenge ourselves with help from art, if we'd like, to experience it in places we wouldn't have imagined before.
If there was a combinational category for that, beauty and sewage would be called bewage, and they would put it out there. It's a new platform.
Yeah,
Also,
could be a perfume.
That could be. Have you had Buage? Wow.
Yes.
It's very fabulous.
Sure.
Also, how are deadbeats writing books? This is ridiculous in 2024. Joke. It's fun. It's true. There's certain views at certain... Timing is a large thing for existence, because if you look at any individual at certain times, you could put this label there, then this label there, this label there. They're not the same. So then, was this that accurate? Was this that accurate? Was this that accurate? It's a funny thing. That person is... No. And then, third thing that comes to mind on the concept of beauty is, I see it somewhat as we have a form of beauty, and then to get to the next one, you have to glitch a lot and expand, and then consolidate back into a... Because I always see life as expansion and consolidation, so you have to do that, and then come back to a newer form that we call that's some form of beauty in a category. And because just expansion is never well perceived by the general populace I've seen, because there's too many ambiguities, like, oh no, that throws me off. But once you bring it into a more, like, it's new, but it's flattened form, then okay, we will accept that, and that's the thing to do. So there's a different concept of beauty in place.
Yeah, well, I would say, on that note, first of all, I love, like, glitch as a verb, but you're hitting on one very interesting explanation for art movements. So there's a fascinating paper that I quote in the book by a professor who sort of argues that, again, what draws us to art is a sort of glitch, if you will, that it introduces us to. And his argument is that essentially you get different artistic movements because artists introduce a sort of new glitch that we haven't seen before. And, if it's too different, like, it may not sort of stick with the sort of consciousness at the time, with the zeitgeist at the time. And if it's too similar, our brains will consider it boring. But if it kind of hits at this right sort of balance between novelty and familiarity, sort of unexpectedness, and what we've seen before, it'll intrigue us, it'll hook us. And so you essentially, the argument kind of goes that, like, art movements evolve as we get used to this sort of new glitch, and then too used to it, and then we begin hungering for some new stimulation, for some new surprise, and then the next thing comes along, and so we sort of like glom onto that, and the next and the next and the next, so forth.
It's funny, we glom onto the glitch. That's good right there. I just realized while you're describing that, if there was like a translated form of your book that translated back to English, it could be called Acquire the Image. Instead of Get the Picture.
Acquire the Image.
That's kind of a glitch in that form there.
Yeah.
That's a funny one. What is one message you would want people to take away from your book? Is it a thing for them to think during their time, or it could be something you would want them to know about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'd want people to understand the importance of exercising our eye. I think, and also the way that, like I said, art can help us really fight the reducing tendencies of our minds. To me, like, the motivating questions behind this journey were really, why does art matter, and how do any of us engage with it more deeply? But in the end, it really went beyond that. And I think that what's important for me to take away is, I think what's important that I hope people take away is the way that art can help us live life differently and more richly. Like, I think art is practice for appreciating life, but it's also practice for living a life worth appreciating. And, I hope that people read the book and begin to look at art differently, but also look at everything differently. And I hope that they feel like they have a sort of roadmap for exercising their own eye and seeing, and by extension, experiencing, and by extension, living more.
That's quite cool. Where can people locate your various material? What would you want them to take a look at?
Yeah, that's sweet of you to ask. So yeah, the book is for sale online at your local independent bookstore. I hope wherever bookstores are found. It's out in the US, it's out in the UK, hopefully coming to other countries near you soon. The book is called, like you said, Get the Picture. It's a New York Times bestseller, and I hope people will read it. There's also an audiobook, which I had the pleasure of reading, and an ebook. And what else can I share? My Instagram is Bosker, and there's also just so many fantastic people in the book, so many great galleries, institutions, and I hope that people check those out as well, that they, go see art in unexpected places, and also, would highly, of course, recommend checking out the work of all the people I talk about in my book.
That is wonderful. Bianca Bosker, I would like to thank you for having been on this episode of the show, describing items from Get the Picture and exploring a bit of the art world and the vision we can take from it.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
And we are out.